In 1903, a British geological survey team crossed the central Sahara and came back with something that nobody in the scientific establishment wanted to explain. They had mapped root systems, not fossilized remains, not buried organic matter consistent with ancient swamps. Root systems, living or recently living, running 40 miles in continuous unbroken channels beneath the sand, deeper than any known plant had ever been documented reaching, wider than any known tree had ever been known to grow. The survey was published in a limited academic run, distributed to 31 institutions across Europe, and then quietly pulled from print within 18 months. No explanation was given. No retraction was issued. The survey stopped existing in any official catalogue. The 31 receiving institutions were later found, through records requests filed decades afterward, to have transferred those copies to restricted archive sections with no public access date assigned. If you have never heard of the 1903 Sahara Root Survey, that is exactly the point. Subscribe now. This is one of those histories that does not stay buried no matter how many times it is put back in the ground. The Sahara Desert covers approximately 3.6 million square miles across northern Africa. It is the largest hot desert on the planet, characterized by extreme aridity, surface temperatures exceeding 160 degrees Fahrenheit at ground level, and sand deposits that in some regions extend more than 600 feet below the surface before reaching bedrock. Modern geology places the Sahara's current arid phase at roughly 5,000 years ago, following a period known as the African Humid Period, during which the region supported grasslands, lakes, rivers, and large animal populations. The standard academic model holds that the transition from green Sahara to desert was gradual, driven by orbital wobble-shifting monsoon patterns. That is the accepted model. That is the version taught without serious challenge in Western academic institutions for over a century. What the 1903 survey introduced was a direct material contradiction to that model that has never been resolved, only suppressed. The survey team was led by a man named Edward Hargrove Callaway, a British geologist attached to the Royal Geographical Society, who had previously conducted mineral surveys in the Rhodesian interior and the upper reaches of the Nile Basin. Callaway was not a fringe figure. He was not an amateur. He had published 12 peer-reviewed papers before the Sahara expedition and maintained correspondence with some of the leading geological minds of his era. He was, by every measure available, a credentialed establishment scientist operating within the sanctioned frameworks of his time. The 1903 expedition was commissioned under the Royal Geographical Society's African Interior Survey Programme, a series of systematic mapping projects that ran from 1889 through 1911 and produced dozens of published documents, most of which remain in the public archive today. The Sahara expedition of 1903 is not among them. If you search the Royal Geographical Society's digital catalogue, you will find no entry for a 1903 Saharan geological survey conducted by Callaway or by any team matching the expedition's described composition. The program records that bracketed exist. The 1902 survey of the Upper Congo Basin exists. The 1904 survey of the Ethiopian highlands exists. The 1903 Sahara survey does not. There is simply a gap. 18 months of an active program with no output, no cancellations recorded, no budget transfers logged, just silence where a document should be. The document itself survived because of a single copy that was never returned. A geological researcher named Peter van den Berg, working at the University of Utrecht in the 1960s, discovered a copy of the original Callaway survey report bound inside a collection of miscellaneous geological field documents donated to the university's geology department in 1921 by the estate of a Dutch colonial administrator named Frederik van der Hoek. Van der Hoek had no known connection to the Royal Geographical Society, no known connection to Callaway, and no documented reason to possess a copy of a British governmental survey. How the document reached him is not known. Van den Berg recognized its significance, made several personal copies, and attempted to publish a summary of the findings in the Netherlands Journal of Earth Sciences. The submission was rejected on the grounds that the primary source could not be independently verified. Van den Berg then requested that the Royal Geographical Society confirm the existence of the original survey. The Society's response stated that no record of the survey could be located and that the document appeared to be either a private working document or possibly a forgery. Van den Berg wrote back, pointing out that the document bore official letterhead, official expedition numbering consistent with other RGS surveys of the period, and signatures that appeared to match known examples of Callaway's handwriting. The Society did not respond to that letter. Van den Berg published nothing on the subject before his death in 1979. His personal copies passed to former graduate students, two of whom eventually made them available to independent researchers in the 1990s. That is how the document entered the public record, not through official channels. Through an estate donation, a Dutch administrator with no known connection to the source institution, a rejected academic paper, and a bureaucratic non-response that raised more questions than it answered. Now, what did the survey actually find? The Callaway expedition entered the Sahara from the north in early spring of 1903, crossing the coastal ranges of what is now Libya and proceeding south and southwest toward the deep desert interior. Their primary mission was mineral assessment, specifically the mapping of potential subsurface deposits of silicates and mineral salts the Royal Geographical Society believed might have commercial extraction value. The expedition used percussion drilling equipment capable of sampling from the surface down to approximately 200 feet, supplemented by deeper borings at selected sites using cable tool rigs capable of reaching as far as 400 feet under favorable conditions. The anomalous findings began approximately 3 weeks into the expedition's inland progress, in a region Callaway's report describes using coordinates consistent with what is now the southeastern corner of Algeria, near the Ahaga mountain range. The team sank a routine borehole at a site that surface readings suggested might contain salt deposits. At 47 feet below the surface, they encountered what Callaway describes as material inconsistent with mineral formation, exhibiting fibrous structure and organic composition. They extracted samples. The samples were identified by the expedition's botanist, a man named Charles Whitmore, who had previously worked on African botanical surveys for Kew Gardens, as root material, not root fossils, not root impressions in mineralized form. Root material in a state of preservation that Whitmore described as exceptional, exhibiting cellular structure intact, retaining what appeared to be moisture channels consistent with active or recently active biological function. The team did not consider this conclusive. A single root at 47 feet could have explanations within the existing framework. Roots of large trees had been documented, reaching depths of 60 to 80 feet in arid environments. Whitmore noted the finding, Callaway logged it, and the expedition continued. At the next site, 14 miles southwest of the first, they found root material again, this time at 89 feet. The material was larger in diameter than the previous sample. Whitmore measured the cross-section at approximately 4 inches. No known plant species produces a root of that diameter at that depth in a desert environment. Callaway describes the team's reaction as one of professional interest. They were not alarmed yet. They were intrigued. What alarmed them came at the third site. 22 miles further southwest, the team sank a deeper boring. At 160 feet, they encountered a root system of such scale that their extraction equipment could not bring a full cross-section to the surface. What they could extract were fragments from the periphery of what Whitmore estimated, based on curvature and cellular channel spacing, to be a root with a primary diameter of somewhere between 18 and 26 inches. To put that in context, the root system of a mature baobab tree, one of the largest species in Africa and one of the most studied for deep water-seeking root systems, reaches a maximum recorded depth of approximately 200 feet and a maximum root diameter of roughly 3 to 4 inches at the deepest extension points. What Whitmore was describing was a root diameter 5 to 8 times larger than the maximum recorded for one of the most extreme root systems known to botanical science, at a depth already at the lower boundary of known root extension, in the middle of what was supposed to be a desert arid for thousands of years. And then Callaway made the decision that defined the rest of the expedition. Instead of continuing the mineral survey, he redirected the team's drilling program to trace the root system. What they found over the following 6 weeks rewrote everything. Or rather, it should have. The root system was not an isolated anomaly. It was part of a network, a connected, branching, coherent biological network extending across the subsurface of a region that Callaway's drilling program eventually mapped at approximately 40 miles in its longest identified dimension. Not 40 feet, not 40 meters, 40 miles. The network showed consistent biological structure throughout. Whitmore identified 3 distinct root diameters corresponding to primary, secondary, and tertiary branching, exactly the pattern you would expect in the root system of an enormous tree or interconnected grove. The deepest boring the team successfully completed reached 380 feet and was still within the root network. They did not reach the bottom. At 380 feet beneath the central Sahara, they were still drilling through connected root material. Callaway's report includes detailed hand-drawn cross-section diagrams of the root samples at each drilling site. It includes Whitmore's botanical analysis notes. It includes Callaway's own geological assessment of the surrounding matrix, which he describes as showing characteristics consistent with former topsoil layers compressed by subsequent sand deposition. The ground these roots grew in was not always desert. It was once surface soil, dense enough to support root growth, then buried under sand. Thousands of feet of sand, in some locations, sitting on top of what had once been living ground. Callaway makes one careful statement near the end of the report worth reading closely. He writes, "If the biological material recovered is of the age consistent with the depth of sand deposition above it, then the organism or organisms that produced this root network were living within a period far more recent than current geological models would support for vegetation of this scale in this region." He does not calculate a date. He does not make claims about what that means. He simply states the material contradiction and leaves it on the page. A scientist noting that what he found does not fit what is supposed to be true and letting the observation stand on its own. That observation then disappeared from the official record. Before examining how and why the survey was buried, it is worth sitting with what the root network implies, if taken at face value. A root system of this scale, in this configuration, points to an organism or ecosystem that dwarfs anything currently known to have existed on Earth's surface. The largest known living organism by area is currently designated as a fungal network in Oregon, covering approximately 2,400 acres. The largest known root system belongs to a clonal aspen grove in Utah. What the Callaway survey describes potentially exceeds all known examples by an order of magnitude, and it is not in a temperate forest. It is under a desert, buried under centuries of sand deposition, preserved in a state that suggests it has not been dead long enough to fully decompose. The Tartarian historical framework, which treats mainstream archaeological timelines as systematically compressed or falsified, places events like the Sahara's green period far more recently than the official model. Within that framework, the Callaway survey is not a mystery. It is confirmation. Physical evidence that the world which existed before the current civilization's recorded history was so different from what we have been told that its remnants, when they surface, have to be suppressed because they cannot be incorporated without dismantling the entire constructed timeline. The root network represents something that was alive, something that required water, nutrient cycling, atmospheric conditions of a kind that the Sahara today cannot support. But the preservation state Whitmore documented suggests the biological timeline is far shorter than the geological one. The sand is old. The roots are not nearly as old as the sand that buried them should require them to be. That is the contradiction Callaway put on paper in 1903. That is the contradiction that got the paper pulled. The suppression of the survey operated on multiple levels simultaneously, which is worth examining in detail because it reveals a pattern. The first level was institutional disappearance. The survey vanished from the Royal Geographical Society's catalogue. The RGS maintained detailed records of every commissioned expedition going back to its founding in 1830. Budget records, commission letters, correspondence files, expedition supply manifests, all of these generate paper trails that persist even when a final report does not. For the 1903 Callaway expedition, none of these supporting documents appear in the public archive. The expedition is gone not just as a published document, but as a bureaucratic event. Someone removed the paperwork. All of it. From multiple administrative systems simultaneously. That level of document removal requires institutional authority and deliberate coordination. It does not happen by accident. The second level was the restricted archive transfers. The 31 institutions that received copies transferred those copies to restricted sections within a remarkably narrow time window, between 1905 and 1908, 3 years after the survey's publication. Someone with enough institutional reach to coordinate with 31 separate academic and governmental bodies in at least 6 European countries, within 3 years, all performing the same action on the same document, that is not organic institutional caution. That is a coordinated removal. The third level was the treatment of individuals who attempted to surface the findings. Van den Berg is the clearest documented case. His submission rejected, his verification request stonewalled, his follow-up correspondence ignored. Researchers who worked with van den Berg's materials in the 1990s documented at least 4 other attempts to publish on the Callaway survey between 1960 and 1995, all encountering the same pattern. The circular logic is elegant in its cruelty. The document cannot be published because it cannot be independently verified. The document cannot be independently verified because the original archive cannot confirm it. The original archive cannot confirm it because the records were removed. The removal cannot be investigated because institutions will not cooperate. The circle closes completely and the information stays inside it. What makes the Callaway case particularly significant within the larger pattern of suppressed geological and historical evidence is the specificity of the threat it represents. A lot of suppressed evidence concerns things ambiguous enough to be argued around. Ancient anomalous structures can be attributed to unknown but human civilizations. Strange geological formations can be filed under natural processes not yet fully understood. Megalithic architecture can be dated controversially. These are all territories where the establishment has room to maneuver, to reframe, to attribute without conceding. Root systems do not allow that room. A root system is a biological object with a cellular structure that corresponds to known biological processes. The rate of organic decomposition in arid conditions is something scientists understand. The relationship between root diameter and organism size is something botanists can model. You cannot look at a 40-mile connected root network at 380 feet below the Sahara's surface and attribute it to a natural geological process. You can only ask what kind of organism made it, how recently it was alive, and why the ground that was once its surface is now buried under hundreds of feet of sand. Every one of those questions leads somewhere the official timeline cannot go. The sand itself is part of the story. One of the persistent alternative history arguments about the Sahara concerns the origin of its sand. The standard model holds that Saharan sand is the product of millions of years of wind erosion, a slow accumulation driven by geological time. The alternative argument, which the Callaway survey's root preservation findings lend significant support to, is that the sand is depositional on a much shorter timescale. Not erosional accumulation over millions of years, but catastrophic deposition over a far shorter period. Silica sand of the kind found throughout the Sahara can form through processes other than slow wind erosion. Impact events, high-temperature geological episodes, and massive rapid water events can all produce silica sand in quantities and on timescales that make the current Saharan deposits possible without requiring millions of years. If the sand is younger than the official model claims, then everything buried under it is younger too. And if the root network Callaway found is younger than the sand above it would normally indicate, then the organism that produced it was alive far more recently than the desert's supposed age would allow, possibly within a historical period that living civilizations could remember, which means there are people whose traditions, whose oral histories, whose suppressed records might contain accounts of what the Sahara was before it became what it is now. And there are official institutions with very strong reasons to ensure those accounts are never corroborated by physical evidence. The Callaway survey is physical evidence. A secondary document surfaces in discussions of the 1903 survey that deserves attention. Among the materials preserved by van den Berg's graduate students is a fragment of what appears to be internal correspondence from the Royal Geographical Society, undated but watermarked with paper stock consistent with the 1904 to 1906 period, that makes reference to the Callaway findings without naming them directly. The fragment discusses the handling of survey materials, presenting, in the correspondence words, conclusions incompatible with foundational chronological assumptions, and specifically mentions botanical findings in terms that clearly describe the root network. The correspondent recommends what they call archival discretion, defined as the transfer of relevant materials to restricted access with no assigned public review date. The letter is signed only with initials, W, H, B. No individual matching those initials has been definitively identified in the Society's known correspondence records for that period. What the fragment reveals is that the suppression was not a reflexive institutional response, it was a considered decision. Someone within or adjacent to the Royal Geographical Society read the Callaway findings, understood their implications, and made a deliberate choice to bury them using established bureaucratic mechanisms. The language of archival discretion implies a framework that already existed. The Callaway survey was not the first thing this mechanism was used on. It was processed through a system already in place. The late 19th and early 20th centuries represent a period of massive institutional consolidation around a particular model of natural history and human prehistory. Darwin's framework for biological change, Lyell's framework for geological time, and the emerging consensus around deep time chronology were all being formalized and defended by scientific establishments with significant authority over publication and funding. The model being constructed required very long timescales, gradual change, and the absence of any evidence that the world had looked dramatically different within periods close enough to living memory. Evidence that contradicted those requirements was not simply an academic inconvenience, it was a structural threat. The mechanisms of suppression did not require conspiracy in the dramatic sense. They operated through normal institutional incentives applied to abnormal findings. But the Callaway case goes beyond normal institutional conservatism. The active removal of records, the coordination across 31 institutions in 6 countries, the restriction of archive access with no review date. These are not the actions of scientists who disagreed with a finding. These are the actions of people who understood that the finding could not be argued away and therefore had to be disappeared. What the root network found by Callaway implies, if followed to its logical conclusion, is not just a modification of the Sahara's timeline. It implies a fundamentally different account of what this planet's surface looked like in the near past. An organism or ecosystem capable of producing a 40-mile root network growing to depths of at least 380 feet under conditions sufficient to maintain moisture channels and cellular integrity implies a world with different water availability, different atmospheric conditions, different biological productivity than anything in the official record. It implies a world that was, by any measure, extraordinarily alive in a place that is now the Earth's largest and most hostile desert. The transition from that world to this one, if it happened fast enough to preserve the roots in the state Whitmore described, was not a gradual process of orbital wobble and monsoon shift. It was an event. Something happened that buried a living ecosystem under hundreds of feet of sand fast enough that the organisms it buried did not have time to fully decompose before the burial preserved them. Something that transformed 3.6 million square miles of living landscape into desert in a time frame short enough to be visible in the preservation state of biological material. What kind of event produces that result is a question that leads directly into the territory of catastrophist history, reset theories, and the pattern of civilizational discontinuity that alternative historians have been documenting across dozens of independent lines of evidence for decades. The Callaway survey is one data point, but it is a physical, documented, non-speculative data point. It is soil samples and botanical measurements and hand-drawn cross-sections made by a credentialed scientist under an official commission, producing findings that were then systematically removed from the public record by people who clearly understood what those findings meant. There is a related body of evidence that the Callaway survey connects to when placed in broader context. Across the Saharan interior, particularly in Libya, Algeria, and Niger, there are extensive rock art sites documented by 20th century archaeologists. The Tassili Narjeh Plateau in Algeria contains thousands of rock paintings showing cattle, hippopotami, crocodiles, and large-scale human habitation. Mainstream archaeology dates these to the African humid period, ending approximately 5,000 years ago. They show a landscape teeming with life in a place now completely inhospitable to the species depicted. But there are also rock art sites in the Sahara that depict things mainstream archaeology has struggled to categorize. Structures researchers have compared to architectural forms not typically associated with the Neolithic cultures supposed to have produced them. Scenes of organized community life and cultivation at a scale not consistent with the nomadic populations the standard model assigns to these periods. The alternative interpretation places them as records of a civilization living in a Sahara that was not a desert, whose physical traces are now buried under the sand that covered their world. The Callaway root network is the physical underpinning of that buried world. Root systems of that scale do not exist in isolation. They exist as part of an ecosystem with water cycling, atmospheric moisture, and biological productivity of a kind the Sahara today cannot support. Something grew above those roots. An entire landscape of something, within a time frame close enough to the present that the roots survived in a state Whitmore described as exhibiting active biological characteristics. When you hold the Callaway survey, the Tassili rock art, the anomalous preservation of organic material in Saharan sand, and the pattern of institutional suppression together, what you see is not a collection of isolated anomalies. What you see is a coherent picture of a covered past, a world that existed within a time frame close enough to the present to leave physical traces, and a systematic effort by official institutions to ensure those traces remain inaccessible. The question of who benefits from maintaining the official timeline is important. There are specific, identifiable interests served by a historical model that places dramatic world change in the deep past rather than the recent past. A timeline in which the last catastrophic transformation of Earth's surface happened thousands of years ago creates a sense of geological and civilizational stability that supports current institutional authority. If the Sahara became a desert 5,000 years ago through gradual natural processes, then the civilizations that exist today are the natural inheritors of an unbroken historical development. The institutions that govern those civilizations carry the legitimacy of historical continuity. If the Sahara became a desert 500 years ago, or 300 years ago, through a catastrophic event that destroyed a prior world, then the civilizations that exist today are not inheritors of an unbroken continuity. They are survivors, or possibly successors, of something that was erased. The institutions that govern them are not ancient and legitimate, they are recent and contingent. The historical narrative that validates their authority is not history. It is mythology constructed to fill the gap left by a deliberate erasure. That is not an abstract distinction. It is a question about the legitimacy of current power structures, current land claims, current narratives of civilizational inheritance. And it is a question that the Callaway Survey, if publicly acknowledged and properly investigated, would force onto the table, which is why the Callaway Survey was pulled from print. The version of history most people have been given is not wrong about everything. It has been shaped, in consistent and documentable ways, to exclude evidence that would require its foundational assumptions to be revised. The Callaway Survey is one of the clearest cases of that exclusion because it is a physical document with a physical removal trail that can be partially reconstructed even after the removal. The coordination across institutions, the timing of the archive transfers, the fragment of internal correspondence recommending archival discretion, these are not speculations, they are documented events. The document existed, the removals happened. The correspondence was written. What is speculative, and what we should be honest about calling speculative, is the full interpretation of what the root network means. Callaway himself did not claim to know what made it. Whitmore's botanical analysis established what it was and documented its preservation state. The implications of that preservation state for the official chronological model are logical inferences, not certainties. Alternative historical frameworks offer one set of interpretations. Other interpretations are possible. What is not possible is the conclusion that the findings were too uncertain to deserve public scientific consideration. They were specific, physical, and documented by qualified professionals. They were pulled not because they were unscientific, but because they were inconvenient. The Van den Berg copies of the Callaway Survey exist. Several independent researchers have examined them. Photographs of specific pages have circulated in alternative history research communities since the mid-1990s. The hand-drawn cross-section diagrams of the root samples are remarkable documents in their own right, clearly the work of a trained technical illustrator producing field documentation. The botanical analysis notes in Whitmore's handwriting are detailed, methodical, written in the language of a working scientist, recording observations rather than arguing a case. These documents sit outside the official record. They cannot be independently verified through official channels because the official channels removed the verification pathway. But they have been examined by enough independent eyes, over enough years, to establish that they are not obvious fabrications. The paper stock is consistent with the period. The letterhead format matches verified RGS documents from the same years. The expedition numbering follows the sequence of confirmed RGS projects from surrounding years. Van den Berg, a professional geologist with no known interest in fringe archaeology, considered them genuine enough to stake his professional reputation on a publication attempt. The history of the 1903 Sahara survey follows a pattern that repeats across dozens of similar cases in alternative historical research. Credentialed person finds anomalous evidence. Evidence is documented in professional format. Document is suppressed through institutional mechanisms. Individual who attempts to surface the evidence encounters institutional non-cooperation. Document survives through unofficial channels. Decades later, fragments of the suppression mechanism become visible, confirming that the suppression was deliberate. The official story is never updated. The anomaly, remains unexplained in the official record. The difference between the Callaway survey and many other suppressed findings is the specificity of what was found. A 40-mile root network at 380 feet of depth with cellular structure intact is not ambiguous. It is a biological object of unprecedented scale, in an impossible location, in an impossible preservation state. It is a remnant of a world that should not have existed as recently as its preservation state requires, in a place where the official account says nothing of that kind could have been. Whatever put the sand over those roots, whatever transformed that living landscape into the Sahara that exists today, its physical evidence is still there. 380 feet below the surface of a desert not supposed to have had anything like that beneath it, extending 40 miles in documented network continuity, preserved in a state a botanist in 1903 described as exhibiting active biological characteristics. It was found, it was documented, it was then made to not exist, and the sand keeps blowing, and the desert stays silent, and somewhere underneath it, in a region of southeastern Algeria, where a British geological team spent 6 weeks drilling boreholes in 1903, the roots are still there. Undisturbed now for over a century since the last human hands touched them, still reaching, still preserving the memory of whatever it was they once held up. The survey was pulled from print, but the roots were not pulled from the ground. They are still there, and they are still waiting to be explained.